One of the other things that we want to talk about in this class is how culture and the experience of military life is different by war cohort. It was a different thing to be a veteran during Vietnam than it was to be a veteran during the first Gulf War, than it is to be a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan. All of these, the experience and the circumstances of being a veteran are going to differ based on the length of the conflict, whether it was a 90-day conflict or whether it is a 20-year war, what the threat was, whether it was a clear threat to the United States like World War II, or whether it was something that was a little bit more ambiguous. What technology was employed, both in weaponry and in other aspects of war? What were the environmental exposures? We've heard about Gulf War syndrome. We've heard about Agent Orange. The most recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, we're talking more about toxic exposures because of burn pits. So those environmental exposures also contribute to the circumstances and the experiences of being a veteran of that conflict. There's also the media influence, and this is how the media portrays the conflict and the experience of war. And this has been very clear during the last 20 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, when we had embedded journalists who could see military action while it was occurring and broadcast that. As well, another aspect that shifts the war cohort and the experience is the type of casualty. So in World War I, World War II, the casualties were much different. People came home. People just didn't come home when they would have, because they would have passed away from their injuries. In more recent conflicts, our medical advances have brought people home that wouldn't have come home before, but they've come home with catastrophic injuries that they wouldn't previously have survived. So the casualty types have even differed. There we go. Now, a brief overview of military structure. Rank. Rank is maybe one of the most important pieces of military culture because it dictates a lot of things, almost everything. So there are three types of ranks. There's the officers, who are the ones who are intended to be the leaders, who are the ones who are making decisions. And then there's the enlisted ranks, who are the ones who are following through on those decisions and executing. Warrant officers sort of act as subject matter experts in particular fields, so they know a lot about a certain area, but they're kind of in the middle between officers and enlisted. Now, when you get up to the higher enlisted ranks, the majority of the military is made up of enlisted ranks, enlisted service members. But as you get up into the higher enlisted ranks, like E5, E6, E7, those are called non-commissioned officers. So officers are commissioned officers, enlisted have non-commissioned officers, and then there's warrant officers. I know that can be confusing, but you'll get it. They all do different things. Non-commissioned officers are the leaders of the enlisted ranks. So they're the ones who ensure that the plans and the orders from the officers get executed appropriately. So here are the enlisted military ranks. These are the blue-collar workers. They complete orders and tasks that are assigned. They make up the large majority of the military. And you can see in different ranks, this doesn't have Space Force on it, but Space Force is going to be very close to Air Force. So you can see what the different patches look like and what they're called. Now, because we like to be confusing, we have the same numerator, like E5, E6, E7, E8, E9, so on, for all of the branches, but they're called different things in different branches. So it might be a staff sergeant in the Army and a staff sergeant in the Marine Corps, but in the Navy, it's a petty officer first class, which is not actually an officer, it's an enlisted service member. Very confusing. Here are the officer ranks. Officers are actually commissioned officers. They give orders and they fill those management and leadership roles. Warrant officers, as I mentioned, are specialized experts in a particular area. So commissioned officers now have to have a college degree. This wasn't always the case. You could be, in generations before, you could have been an officer without a degree, but we've recently shifted that. Here I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure of the military. This is the Army in particular. Each branch does it a little differently, but they do have a similar sort of structure in that there are small groups of people, squads in the Army, which could be 4 to 10 soldiers, and a bunch of squads make up a platoon or a bigger group. And as we go up, the person in charge of each of these groups goes up in rank. So a non-commissioned officer, an enlisted service member like an E5 or E6, could be in charge of a squad. And then there's a platoon that has more service members. It's made up of multiple squads, and multiple platoons make up a company, and multiple companies make up a battalion, and you see how I'm going from here. So it's built from little pieces into one large division or group. Now, let me talk a little bit about the average service member. This is the most common type of service member. Now, that said, there is a lot of diversity within the military. So there's all of the ranks are represented, of course. A whole bunch of different ages are represented. They're going to have lots of different time in service and so on. But the majority of the military is made up of young enlisted service members. So the average service member is an E4. It's an enlisted service member who's been in service for about 4 years. They are about 22 years old. They usually have joined right after high school. The average service member is married with 2 children and living on their base pay of a little less than $2,000 a month. Now, your pay varies, of course, depending on where you live and what your housing circumstances and what your rank is and and the dependents that you have and so on. But in many places, it can be hard to survive on $2,000 a month when you're supporting 4 people. Now, most of the military is male, but that is shifting. Up to 15% more than 15% actually of new recruits are female. So of the military as a whole, about 15% of service members are female, although it varies depending on branch. There are fewer in the Marine Corps, there are more in the Air Force, and it differs by officer and enlisted as well. So this is what the average service member looks like. This is not everybody in the service. Often the average workday means they leave early in the morning, prior at like 5:30 or so, do their physical training as a group, and they go home for the day when the mission is done, or they are released, which could be 1 o'clock in the afternoon, it could be 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock at night. It just depends. So let's talk a little bit about culture. First of all, what is culture? Culture is a set of things. It's a set of values and beliefs and traditions and norms and perceptions and behaviors that all taken together control and guide and govern how members of a group, how they think, how they behave, how they interact with one another. So that begs the question, is the military a culture? We talk about cultures of different countries and what is the norm in that country, what is the norm in that region. The military also has its own set of values and beliefs. Obviously, it has its own set of traditions. If you've ever been a part of a Marine Corps, like Marine Corps birthday ball, lots of traditions, lots of norms and perceptions. And the members sort of correct themselves and guide each other back to what is considered normal. So the military as a whole has its own language. It's got a lot of acronyms and ways of talking about things. Obviously, it has its own set of clothing. Each branch has its own values. The military has its own music. It has a belief structure and values that are associated with that belief structure. Obviously has lots of expected behaviors and lots of correction when you deviate from those expected behaviors. And lots of knowledge and stories and tradition, that is, stories that are passed down from one generation to another, all of which are imbued with different meaning, all of which are socially transmitted, meaning they are passed on from one generation to another, from the leadership, from the elders to elders, older service members or higher ranking service members to the younger ones. and they're intentionally transmitted to regulate and govern behavior. So some of the values that are imbued in military culture are consistent across the branches, and those are duty and loyalty and honor and tradition and making meaning and having a purpose, making a difference, sacrificing your safety and your freedom for the safety and freedom of others, being held to a higher standard as a representative of the country. Now, all of these things are going to be different for different people. Different individuals are going to identify with different aspects of the culture to a greater or lesser degree. So for some people, this military culture is a deeply, deeply ingrained part of who they are. Maybe it's part of their family tradition. So it is part of who they are as a person from when they were raised. For others, they don't identify as closely with this military culture and this set of norms. Again, values can include discipline, having a hierarchy or a clear ranking structure, focusing on the group over the individual. That is a really important piece because that is different from civilian culture. And the military culture uses symbols and traditions to maintain the connection amongst themselves, as well as their distinction from civilians and their distinction from other cultures. For the military, the mission comes first. It comes above your personal safety, your personal preferences, often even your family circumstances. The mission always comes first. Often, especially for active duty, they're highly mobile. They usually move every 2 to 3 years. It's sometimes more, sometimes less. Often for officers' families, they move more frequently, and for often enlisted, they may move less frequently, but mobility is a key characteristic of active duty military family life. There is also the hierarchy, which I mentioned. There are rules that govern, the cultural rules that govern a separation between officer and enlisted rank. Housing, and all of these, lots of things are governed or guided by that rank structure, including housing. Military housing is distinguished by rank. Often socialization is distinguished by rank, not because of any formal rule, just because of that is part of the culture. This can have impacts on spouses and children as well, as they integrate that hierarchy and that socialization by rank into their own lives as well, to greater or lesser degree, depending on the circumstances in the family and the individual. So I mentioned earlier that there are also subcultures the military is not one culture as a whole, although it has some common characteristics. There are also subcultures that are distinguished by branch or by component or by different types of units like fighter squadrons or submarines or special forces or recon units or so on. Also by their military occupational specialty or their job. So there is often a distinction between combat arms and non-combat arms, artillery and infantry, or combat support. There are different subcultures amongst each of those groups. And it is distinct in many ways. It's very different from our U.S. general social culture. In our civilian society, we focus more on having choices and having the freedom to choose lots of different things and having their independence and being unique and different, and consuming or bringing in or consuming things and buying things. And often it's very wasteful. We express emotions, and there's not always structure or a clear purpose. There's sometimes disorder and chaos. In the military, it's kind of almost the exact opposite. The focus is on order and discipline and structure and having a hierarchy and being one of many, not unique. You're like everybody else that's the same rank as you. Having a collective focus, making things work instead of just throwing it out, and stoicism. So you can see how there's distinguished between what is normal, what the cultural norm in U.S. society, and what the cultural norm in the military is. And those norms are often essential because life relies on it when you're part of the military. You need to be part of a group in order to survive.